I always believed Mark meant it when he said, "in sickness and in health," at our wedding. The vows echoed through the grand cathedral as he looked into my eyes with what I thought was unwavering devotion. 5 years later, I learned what those words actually meant to him when the oncologist said, "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm afraid it's stage 3 breast cancer." The day Mark walked out, exactly 17 days after my first chemotherapy session, I was too weak to chase after him, too nauseous to call his name, too devastated to fully comprehend what was happening. I just watched through the window as he loaded his carefully packed suitcases into his BMW and drove away without a backward glance. 3 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, his name appeared on my phone for the first time since he'd abandoned me. I almost didn't answer. Maybe I should have let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. "Olivia," he said, his voice oddly strained. "I need to talk to you. It's important." What Mark didn't know was just how much had changed while he was gone. What he couldn't possibly have realized was that his desperate call had reached a very different woman than the one he'd left behind. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning sunlight streamed through our bedroom windows, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors of our Victorian brownstone in Boston's historic Beacon Hill neighborhood. I stretched languidly in our king-sized bed, my hand reaching instinctively for Mark's warmth beside me, finding only cool sheets instead. "Mark!" I called out, my voice still husky with sleep. "In the kitchen," he replied. "Making your favorite." The scent of blueberry pancakes and fresh coffee drifted up the stairs. I smiled, wrapping myself in my silk robe, a 5th anniversary gift from Mark just 3 months earlier. This was our Saturday ritual: slow mornings, homemade breakfast, followed by wandering through the city's farmers markets or art galleries. Mark Reynolds and I had met during graduate school at MIT. I was pursuing my PhD in biomedical engineering, while he was finishing his MBA. We were the power couple everyone envied: ambitious, compatible, and madly in love. At least that's what I believed. After graduation, I joined Nexus Pharmaceuticals, eventually becoming their director of research and development. Mark built an impressive career in venture capital, specializing in biotech investments. We purchased our dream home, traveled extensively, and planned meticulously for a future that seemed limitless. "You know what today is?" Mark asked as I entered the kitchen, handing me a steaming mug of coffee exactly how I liked it. 1 sugar, splash of cream. "Saturday?" I teased, accepting the coffee and inhaling its rich aroma. 5 years and 3 months since I convinced the most brilliant woman in Boston to marry me, he replied, leaning in to kiss me. His lips tasted of coffee and promise. "Seems like yesterday," I murmured against his mouth. "Best decision I ever made," he said, turning back to flip a perfectly golden pancake. I watched him move confidently around our gourmet kitchen, his dark hair still damp from his morning shower, his shoulders broad beneath his fitted t-shirt. At 36, Mark Reynolds was more attractive than when we'd met. Success had given him a magnetic confidence that turned heads whenever we entered a room. "The Andersons invited us to their lake house next weekend," Mark mentioned, sliding pancakes onto warmed plates. "James just closed that pharmaceutical merger I helped finance. They're celebrating." "Sounds perfect," I agreed, taking a bite of the fluffy pancakes. "I could use a weekend away." I didn't mention the persistent fatigue that had been plaguing me for weeks, or the concerning lump I'd found during my shower 3 days earlier. I'd scheduled a doctor's appointment for Monday, but didn't want to worry Mark with what was probably nothing. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, his hazel eyes studying me with the intensity that had first drawn me to him. "You seem distracted lately." "Just work stress," I lied, forcing a smile. "The new cancer treatment protocol is in final testing phases, and the board is pushing for results," Mark nodded sympathetically. That's my girl, changing the world one breakthrough at a time. If only he knew how ironic those words would soon become. Monday's appointment led to mammograms, which led to biopsies, which led to the devastating diagnosis 2 weeks later. Stage 3 breast cancer. Aggressive. Requiring immediate treatment. I sat in the oncologist's office, Dr. Sharma's kind eyes watching me carefully as she explained the treatment plan. We'll start with chemotherapy to shrink the tumor before surgery, she explained. Based on your age and the cancer type, I'm recommending an aggressive approach. 6 months of chemo, followed by surgery, then radiation. Will I swallowed hard, forcing the words past the lump in my throat. Will I lose my hair? It seemed such a vain question in the face of mortality, but somehow it made the diagnosis real in a way statistics and treatment plans didn't. Most likely. Yes, Dr. Sharma answered gently. But there are excellent cold cap therapies that can minimize hair loss for some patients. We can discuss those options. Mark sat beside me, his face pale, his hand gripping mine so tightly it almost hurt. He hadn't spoken since Dr. Sharma had said the word cancer. What about work? I asked, thinking of the research team depending on me. The cancer treatment ironically similar to the one my own team was developing. You'll need to reduce your workload significantly, Dr. Sharma advised. Chemotherapy is demanding on your body. Rest will be essential. The drive home was silent. Mark stared straight ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. I watched his profile, waiting for him to say something, anything, to acknowledge the seismic shift in our lives. Mark? I finally ventured as we pulled into our driveway. Talk to me, please. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. What do you want me to say, Olivia? That everything will be fine? I know what to do with this. His voice cracked slightly. Because I don't. I reached for his hand. We'll figure it out together. That's what we do, remember? He nodded, but something in his eyes had changed, a distance I'd never seen before. I told myself it was a shock, that he just needed time to process. The next few weeks became a blur of preparations. I arranged a reduced schedule at work, promoted my assistant to handle day-to-day operations, and began meeting with my medical team. Friends and colleagues sent flowers, offered help, and organized meal trains. My sister Claire flew in from Seattle, promising to stay through the first round of treatments. Mark went through the motions, driving me to appointments, nodding at doctor's instructions, holding my hand when required. But each day he seemed to recede further into himself, spending longer hours at the office, taking calls in another room, sleeping on the far edge of our bed. The morning of my first chemotherapy session, I woke to find him standing at our bedroom window, staring out at the city skyline. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice small in the pre-dawn darkness. He turned, his expression haunted. I know, he said. So am I. Claire drove me to the hospital that day. Mark had an emergency meeting he couldn't reschedule. I told myself it was understandable. He had investors relying on him, commitments he couldn't break. Claire's disapproving expression said otherwise, but she remained silent out of loyalty to me. The chemotherapy suite was surprisingly peaceful. Soft lighting, comfortable recliners, kind nurses who explained every step. The needle prick was nothing compared to the weight of fear pressing against my chest. As the drugs flowed into my veins, I closed my eyes and imagined them as tiny warriors battling the cancer cells, fighting for my future. When I arrived home, weak and nauseated, Mark was waiting with ginger tea and saltine crackers. He'd researched what might help with chemo side effects. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe we would find our way through this together after all. But as the days passed and the side effects intensified, the vomiting, the bone-deep fatigue, the first strands of hair on my pillow, Mark, grew increasingly distant. He slept in the guest room, claiming my restlessness kept him awake. He worked later, saying he needed to secure our financial future given my reduced income. He touched me less, as though my illness might be contagious. 17. Days after my first treatment, I woke from a fitful sleep to the sound of drawers opening and closing. Mark was packing, methodically, efficiently, the way he approached everything in life. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice hoarse from vomiting the night before. He paused, his back to me. "I can't do this, Olivia." "Do what?" "This." He gestured, vaguely toward me, still not meeting my eyes. "The sickness, the hospitals, watching you." He trailed off. "Watching me what? Fight for my life?" Anger gave me strength I didn't know I had. I pushed myself up against the pillows. "This isn't exactly a picnic for me either, Mark." "I know." He finally turned to face me, and what I saw in his eyes chilled me more than any diagnosis. Emptiness. Detachment. "I never signed up to be a caretaker. That's not who I am." "You signed?" "Up for in sickness and in health," I reminded him, tears burning my eyes. "People say a lot of things when everything's perfect." He closed the suitcase with a decisive click. "I've transferred money to your account. It should cover the mortgage for 6 months. Claire can stay as long as you need. The medical insurance? Through my company will continue until the divorce is finalized." Divorce? The word felt like another diagnosis, unexpected, terminal. "My lawyer will be in touch." Mark lifted the suitcase from the bed. "I'm sorry, Olivia. I truly am. But I need to live my life." I watched him through the bedroom window as he loaded his carefully packed suitcases into his BMW and drove away without a backward glance. Too weak to chase after him, too nauseous to call his name, too devastated to fully comprehend what was happening. In that moment, as the autumn leaves swirled in his wake, I couldn't possibly have imagined how our paths would cross again, or that when they did, I would be the one holding his future in my hands. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The days after Mark left blurred together in a haze of chemotherapy and heartbreak. I'd wake up each morning with dual waves of nausea, one from the powerful drugs coursing through my system, the other from the sickening realization that my husband had abandoned me when I needed him most. Claire became my rock, my caretaker, my fiercest defender. She moved into our guest room permanently, putting her Seattle life on indefinite hold. The first morning after Mark left, I found her in the kitchen, furiously scrubbing countertops that were already clean. "I could kill him," she said when she noticed me standing in the doorway, my body wrapped in the warmth of the oversized cardigan that now hung loosely on my shrinking frame. Actually kill him, with my bare hands. "Get in line," I tried to joke, but my voice cracked, betraying the depth of my pain. Claire immediately softened, abandoning her angry cleaning to guide me to a chair. "You need to eat something, even just a few bites of toast." I nodded, though food had become my enemy. Everything tasted like metal, nothing stayed down. But I tried for Claire's sake, for the medical team that reminded me nutrition was crucial to withstanding the onslaught of treatment. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks after Mark's departure, delivered by courier to our brownstone. His timing, as always, was impeccable. The same day I lost the first significant clump of hair in the shower. I stood there, watching my chestnut strands swirl down the drain, my scalp tender and unfamiliar beneath my fingertips, while Claire signed for the envelope downstairs. "We don't have to open this today," Claire said, tucking the envelope into a drawer. "Or ever, if you don't want to. We can get our own lawyer when you're stronger." But I insisted on reading them. I needed to understand exactly what Mark was. Proposing needed to face this new betrayal head-on rather than let it ambush me later. The terms were surprisingly generous on the surface. Mark would continue to cover my health insurance through his company's premium plan until the divorce was finalized, which could take up to a year given Massachusetts laws. I would keep the brownstone, with him covering the mortgage for 6 months. We would split our investment account 60-40 in my favor. His lawyer had even included a note that Mark was amenable to negotiation regarding alimony given Mrs. Reynolds' medical situation. "He's trying to buy his freedom," Claire scoffed, reading over my shoulder. "Assuaging his guilt with money." She was right, of course. The financial terms were Mark's way of paying off his conscience, generous enough that mutual friends would think he'd done right by me, but structured to ensure his swift and complete exit from my life. The health insurance provision wasn't generosity. It was a legal necessity until our divorce was complete. I set the papers aside, too exhausted to process them fully. "I'll deal with this later." Later became days, then weeks. I had more pressing battles to fight, like making it through each chemotherapy session, like gathering the courage to shave my remaining hair when the patchy loss became too difficult to disguise, like learning to recognize the stranger in the mirror with her hollow eyes and colorless skin. Dr. Sharma monitored my progress closely, adjusting medications to manage side effects, scanning for signs that the aggressive treatment was working. "Your blood markers are showing a positive response," she told me 6 weeks in, her smile cautiously optimistic. "The tumor is beginning to shrink." Small victories became everything. Managing a full breakfast without vomiting, walking to the corner store without needing to rest. A day with pain manageable enough that I didn't reach for the prescription meds. These moments gave me something to cling to when darkness threatened to overwhelm me. Work became my mental salvation. Though I couldn't manage full days in the lab, I arranged for video conferences with my research team 3 times a week. The irony wasn't lost on me. Directing cancer research while battling the disease myself gave me unique insights that my colleagues found invaluable. On my strongest days, I even went into the lab, wearing a mask to protect my compromised immune system, reviewing data and suggesting protocol modifications. "Dr. Reynolds, these adjustments to the protein sequencing are brilliant," my lead researcher, Amit, told me during one session. "The preliminary results show a 28% increase in effectiveness." "Sometimes the clearest insights come from the darkest places," I replied, not mentioning that I'd formulated the approach during a particularly brutal night of post-chemo insomnia. Financial reality intruded 2 months after Mark's departure. While his support covered immediate expenses, the long-term picture was daunting. Even with insurance, the medical bills mounted. I'd reduced my work hours, impacting my income. Claire had depleted her savings staying with me instead of returning to her job in Seattle. "We need to make decisions about the divorce terms," my lawyer, Diane Lockhart, advised during a consultation in my living room. A formidable woman in her 50s with a reputation for ruthlessness in divorces involving medical abandonment, Diane had taken my case with unconcealed outrage at Mark's behavior. "Mark's offer is strategic, not generous," she explained, reviewing. The document spread across my coffee table. "By controlling the health insurance, he maintains leverage. Once the divorce is final, you'd transition to COBRA coverage, which would cost you thousands monthly given your pre-existing condition." "So what are my options?" I asked, trying to focus through the fatigue that had become my constant companion. "We counter-propose a settlement that includes guaranteed health coverage beyond the divorce, either through continued enrollment in his company plan or with him covering premium costs directly." Diane made notes in her elegant handwriting. "Given the circumstances of his departure during critical medical treatment, we have considerable moral leverage. No judge wants to be the one who cuts off a cancer patient's health insurance." The word morale caught in my throat. There had been a time when I believed Mark's moral compass was aligned with mine, when I would have staked my life on his character. Now I was literally staking my life on legal maneuvers to protect myself from his callousness. That evening, after Diane left, I found myself in what had been our home office, now converted to Claire's temporary workspace. She was on a video call with her employer in Seattle, negotiating extended leave. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her words stopped me cold. "I understand the position this puts the company in," Claire was saying, her voice strained but professional. "But my sister is fighting for her life. She has no one else." A pause as the unseen manager responded. "I appreciate the unpaid leave option, but 3 more months might not be enough. The treatment protocol runs for at least—" Another pause, longer this time. "I see. Yes, I understand company policy." Her voice had gone flat. "Then I'll need to tender my resignation, effective immediately." Horror washed over me. Claire was sacrificing her career, a vice presidency at a software company she'd spent 12 years building, for me. I stepped into the room after she ended the call. "You can't do that." Claire jumped slightly, then composed her face into a casual smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do what? Raid the fancy chocolate stash you think I don't know about? Too late." "Give up your job for me," I clarified, moving further into the room. "I heard you just now." The forced brightness left her face. "It's just a job, Liv. It's your career, your security, your future." I sank into the chair across from her, suddenly lightheaded. "I can't let you do this. You're not letting me do anything. I'm making my own choices." Claire closed her laptop decisively. "And, quite frankly, given what your husband did, I'm not leaving you to face this alone. But your apartment, your life in Seattle—" "Can wait," she finished firmly. "Look, I've been running numbers. My savings will last another 4 months. The severance they're giving me stretches that to 6. By then you'll be through the worst of treatment. We'll figure out the rest as we go." I stared at my younger sister, the wild spirit who had backpacked through South America, who changed jobs and apartments with breezy confidence, who had always valued freedom above security. Now she was anchoring herself to my sickness, my struggle, my uncertain future. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing on my bones, I faced the stark reality of what cancer and Mark's abandonment had created, a vortex pulling down not just me, but everyone who loved me. Claire's career, our shared financial security, the research project I'd spent years building, now progressing under others' direction. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly feel the magnitude of what had been stolen from me. Not just health and a husband, but certainty, independence, dignity. Curled on my side in what had once been our marital bed, I finally broke completely, sobs tearing through my weakened body until there was nothing left but hollow exhaustion. Morning came, as it inevitably does even on the darkest nights. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows Claire had opened, the scent of fresh coffee drifting up the stairs. With effort, I rose, catching my reflection in the bedroom mirror, a gaunt face, bare scalp covered by a silk scarf, dark circles beneath. My eyes, I barely recognized myself. But something had shifted during the night's breakdown. Behind the exhaustion in my eyes, I saw a glimmer of something I thought had been extinguished: determination. Mark had walked away, believing he was leaving behind a diminished version of me, a burden he hadn't signed up for. What he couldn't possibly have known was that in the crucible of cancer and abandonment, a different woman was slowly being forged, someone stronger, clearer-eyed, and far less forgiving than the wife he'd abandoned. 4 months into my chemotherapy treatment, as winter settled over Boston with unforgiving intensity, I received a call that would alter the trajectory of my post-Mark life. I was sitting in Dr. Sharma's office for my regular assessment, waiting for her to return with my latest scan results when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Olivia Reynolds?" A crisp, professional voice inquired when I answered. "Yes, speaking," I replied, automatically straightening in my chair despite my fatigue. "This is Catherine Montgomery from Vertex Pharmaceuticals. I've been following your research on targeted protein therapies for triple-negative breast cancer with great interest. Do you have a moment to discuss a potential opportunity?" I blinked in surprise. Vertex was one of the leading biotech companies in the country, known for groundbreaking work in precision medicine. While my research at Nexus had earned respect in academic circles, I hadn't expected it to draw attention from a pharmaceutical giant during my medical leave. Yes, of course, I managed, trying to sound more composed than I felt. "Excellent. To be direct, Dr. Reynolds, we're establishing a new division focused on immunotherapy approaches similar to your work at Nexus. We'd like to discuss the possibility of bringing you on board to lead it." The irony was almost painful. After months of feeling like my professional identity was slipping away alongside my health, here was validation that my work, my mind, still held value. Yet I could barely make it through a 4-hour day at the lab, let alone take on leadership at a major corporation. "I'm honored by your interest, Ms. Montgomery, but I should be transparent. I'm currently undergoing cancer treatment myself. My capacity is limited at the moment." There was a slight pause before Catherine responded. "Yes, we're aware of your health situation, Dr. Reynolds. In fact, it's part of why we're approaching you now." "I don't understand." "Your dual perspective, as both a researcher and patient, provides insights that are invaluable to us. We're prepared to create a flexible arrangement that accommodates your treatment schedule and recovery. Part-time initially, with the option to transition to full leadership when you're ready." Before I could formulate a response, Dr. Sharma returned, her expression giving away nothing about my scan results. I quickly arranged to continue the conversation with Catherine later that week and ended the call. "Good news?" Dr. Sharma asked, noticing something in my expression. "Possibly," I replied, "but I'm more interested in what you have to tell me." She smiled then, the first genuine, unguarded smile I'd seen from her since my diagnosis. "The tumor has decreased by nearly 60%. Your response to treatment is exceeding our expectations." Relief flooded me so intensely that for a moment I couldn't speak. Dr. Sharma continued reviewing the scans, pointing out the areas of most significant reduction, explaining what this meant for the next phase of treatment. But my mind had latched onto a single thought. I was going to survive this. Not just the cancer, but everything that came with it. Mark's abandonment, the financial strain, the uncertain future. "We'll continue with the remaining chemotherapy sessions as planned," Dr. Sharma explained, "but based on these results, we can begin discussing surgical options earlier than anticipated." That evening, I shared both pieces of news with Claire over the simple dinner she'd prepared. Her famous lemon chicken soup, one of the few foods that didn't taste metallic to my chemo-altered taste buds. "Vertex Pharmaceuticals?" Claire whistled. "Oh, that's Major League, Liv. And they want to work around your treatment schedule?" "Apparently my cancer makes me more valuable to them, not less," I replied, still trying to process the concept myself. "They're interested in the perspective I bring as both researcher and patient. That's," Claire searched for the right word, "karmic? The universe balancing out Mark's garbage with an actual appreciation of what you're going through?" I smiled, wryly. "More likely savvy business sense on their part. Patient-informed research is the latest trend in pharmaceutical development." "Don't diminish this," Claire insisted, "and definitely don't attribute it to luck or timing. They want you because you're brilliant at what you do, cancer or no cancer." 2 days later, I met with Catherine Montgomery and Edward Chen, Vertex's research director, at a quiet cafe near my brownstone, their suggestion saving me the fatigue of traveling to their Cambridge headquarters. Despite my careful makeup and the stylish head wrap Claire had helped me select, I knew I looked ill. The weight loss, the pallor, the careful way I moved, all betrayed my condition. Yet Catherine and Edward seemed to look past the physical manifestations of my disease, focusing instead on my research methodology, my published findings, my innovative approaches to protein targeting. For 2 hours, we engaged in the kind of stimulating scientific discussion I'd been missing. Equal colleagues exploring complex problems, not a patient being managed or a sick wife being abandoned. Our initial proposal, Catherine said as our meeting concluded, sliding a folder across the table, includes significant flexibility, excellent health benefits, and equity options that vest immediately, rather than over the standard 4-year period. I opened the folder, scanning the document inside, my eyes widening at the compensation figures. This is quite generous. It reflects your value to us, Edward said simply. Take some time to review it with your legal advisors. We're prepared to make adjustments to accommodate your specific needs. As they left, Catherine paused. One more thing, Dr. Reynolds. Regardless of your decision about our offer, we'd like to invite you to join our patient advisory board. It's a separate commitment, compensated separately, and would give you the opportunity to influence how we approach research across all our therapeutic areas. The meeting left me energized in a way I hadn't experienced since before my diagnosis. Walking home through the gentle snowfall, I found myself making mental notes about research directions, potential collaboration points, questions to explore. My scientist's mind reawakening after months of survival-focused existence. When I arrived home, I found Diane Lockhart waiting in my living room with Claire, documents spread across the coffee table, both women wearing expressions that combined triumph and grim satisfaction. Perfect timing, Diane said as I unwound my scarf. We've just received some interesting information about Mark's company. What kind of information? I asked, settling carefully onto the sofa. The kind that substantially strengthens our position in the divorce, she replied, handing me a folder. Mark's venture capital firm, Reynolds Partners, is in the final stages of a merger with High Point Capital. The deal is worth approximately $380 million. I stared at the documents, the business language familiar yet somehow distant after months focused on medical terminology instead of financial. How does this affect our situation? In 3 critical ways, Diane explained, her precise tone reflecting her methodical thinking. First, Mark's personal stake in the merger is significant, approximately $42 million in stock options and cash consideration. This dramatically changes the financial landscape of your divorce settlement. Second, Claire interjected, unable to contain her satisfaction. The merger agreement includes a key man provision specifically naming Mark. His personal conduct and public standing affect the deal's valuation. Diane nodded. Which brings us to the third point. Massachusetts is a no-fault divorce state, but abandonment during critical medical treatment creates significant reputational exposure for Mark. If this became public, particularly in the context of the merger, it would damage the deal. Finished, understanding immediately. Mark's new partners wouldn't appreciate headlines about their newest executive abandoning his cancer-stricken wife. Precisely. Diane's smile held no warmth. And the timing is particularly fortuitous. The merger is scheduled to close in approximately 6 weeks, coinciding with when Mark's lawyers have been pushing to finalize your divorce. I sat back, processing. This unexpected leverage. For months I'd felt powerless, at the mercy of my disease, dependent on Claire's sacrifice, vulnerable to the legal maneuvers of Mark's expensive attorneys. Now, suddenly, I held something valuable, the power to proceed. Quietly, or to make noise at a particularly damaging time. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked Diane, though I already sensed her direction. A revised settlement proposal. She pulled another document from her briefcase. One that includes permanent health insurance coverage, not just through the divorce, but indefinitely. Mark would establish a medical trust covering all your healthcare needs. Treatments, procedures, medications, supportive care, regardless of your employment situation or the health insurance marketplace. The proposition was breathtaking in its audacity, and its perfection. Mark, who had walked away from in sickness and in health, would be permanently bound to the sickness part of our vows, financially, if not physically. He'll never agree to this, I said, though part of me desperately wanted to believe he might. He will if the alternative is public exposure during the most crucial business deal of his career, Diane countered. We're not asking for half his merger proceeds or punitive damages, just the healthcare security he promised at the altar and then abandoned. It's entirely defensible in both legal and public opinion courts. I looked at the Vertex offer still in my hand, then at Diane's proposal on the table. Two unexpected resources had appeared almost simultaneously, one offering me a path forward professionally, the other a means to secure my medical future regardless of how my health journey unfolded. Send the proposal, I decided, a strange calm settling over me. But don't threaten explicitly. Let him connect the dots himself. Later that night, after Claire had gone to bed, I stood at the window watching the snow blanket Beacon Hill Inn, pristine white. 6 months ago, my biggest concerns had been meeting research deadlines and planning our anniversary trip to Italy. Now I was calculating leverage in a divorce while fighting for my life. Yet despite everything, the physical pain, the emotional trauma, the uncertain prognosis, I felt a curious strength building within me. Not the confident strength of my pre-cancer life, but something more tempered, more resilient. Like steel forged in fire, I was becoming something different than I had been before. Harder in some ways, yes, but also more authentic. Mark had walked away believing he was leaving, behind a diminished version of his wife. He couldn't have anticipated that his abandonment would ultimately make me more formidable than I'd ever been in his presence. Mark's response to our settlement proposal came swiftly and predictably. 3 days after Diane sent the revised terms, his lawyer requested an urgent meeting, the terse email barely concealing their dismay at our audacious demands. "This is a good sign," Diane assured me as we prepared for the video conference from her downtown office. I'd insisted on attending, despite being only 2 days post-chemotherapy. They wouldn't be rushing to respond if they weren't concerned. I nodded, adjusting the silk scarf around my head and checking my reflection in the small mirror Claire had slipped into my purse. The woman looking back at me was still gaunt, still pale, but her eyes held a clarity that had been missing for months. I applied a touch of lip color, a small act of defiance against the disease that had stripped away so many aspects of my femininity. "Remember," Diane cautioned as her assistant set up the video call, "let me do most of the talking. Your presence alone sends the message we need to convey." Mark's attorney, Gerald Hoffman, appeared on screen first, silver-haired, impeccably groomed, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had negotiated hundreds of high-stakes divorces. A moment later, Mark himself came into view beside him. I had prepared myself for this moment, or thought I had. But seeing Mark's face after 6 months, his healthy complexion, the expensive haircut, the crisp collar of what I recognized as a new shirt I'd never seen, sent an unexpected jolt through me. While I'd been fighting for my life, growing thinner, and weaker with each treatment, he had been thriving. "Olivia," he said, his voice carrying a carefully measured note of concern, "you're looking, well." The transparent lie hung in the air between us. I met his gaze steadily, saying nothing, letting him see exactly what his abandonment had wrought. His eyes flickered away first. "Let's get straight to the point," Gerald began, shuffling papers importantly. "We've reviewed your latest proposal, and frankly, it's completely unreasonable. An indefinite medical trust with no limitations? It's unprecedented and overly punitive." Diane smiled thinly. "Is it punitive to expect Mr. Reynolds to honor the fundamental promises he made to my client? Promises he chose to abandon precisely when they became most meaningful?" "Marriage vows are not legally binding contracts," Gerald countered. "No, but..." They do establish a moral framework that judges find compelling, particularly in cases involving medical abandonment during life-threatening illness. Diane's tone remained conversational, but her words landed with precision. And public opinion tends to be even less forgiving than the legal system in such matters. Mark shifted in his chair, a barely perceptible movement that nonetheless caught my attention. I knew that subtle tell from our years together. It signaled discomfort, anxiety. "What exactly are you implying, counselor?" Gerald asked, his tone sharpening. "Nothing at all. I'm simply noting that Mrs. Reynolds has been remarkably discreet about her husband's decision to leave her 17 days after her first chemotherapy treatment. She hasn't shared this story with their mutual friends, business, associates, or the medical community where she remains highly respected despite her illness." The strategic mention of business associates wasn't lost on Mark. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This proposed trust," Diane continued, "simply ensures that Mrs. Reynolds's medical needs, created in part by the stress of abandonment during critical treatment, are permanently addressed by the man who promised to stand by her in sickness and in health. It's not punitive, it's restorative." Gerald launched into a lengthy counter-argument about reasonable limitations, standard divorce, protocols, and the need for finality in separation agreements. Throughout his monologue, I kept my eyes steadily on Mark, who increasingly avoided my gaze. When Gerald finally paused for breath, I spoke for the first time, my voice quiet but unwavering. "Mark!" The single word silenced the room. Mark reluctantly met my eyes. "You walked out when I was too weak to stand on my own. You packed your bags while I was vomiting from the treatments meant to save my life." I stated these facts without emotion, as if reciting details from a scientific paper. "Now you're concerned about finality and reasonable limitations?" "Olivia, you have to understand," Mark began, but I cut him off with a slight shake of my head. "I understand perfectly. You want your freedom without consequences. You want to protect your assets, your reputation, your future." I leaned forward, slightly, letting him see the full reality of what his abandonment had cost me. "But actions have consequences, Mark. Even yours." Gerald attempted to redirect the conversation, but Mark raised a hand to stop him, his eyes never leaving my face. "What exactly do you want, Olivia?" Exactly what Diane outlined. A medical trust that guarantees my healthcare needs will be met, regardless of how my condition evolves. No time limitations, no coverage caps, no contingencies based on my employment or remarriage status. "And if I agree to this?" Mark asked, his business instincts clearly calculating potential losses. "Then we proceed with a quiet, dignified divorce. I make no public statements about the circumstances of our separation. Your reputation remains intact during this particularly sensitive business period in your career." The implied knowledge of his pending merger hung in the air between us. Mark's expression shifted from calculation to grudging respect, perhaps even a flicker of the admiration he'd once felt for my strategic thinking. "We'll need to modify some of the specific terms," Gerald interjected, clearly trying to regain control of the negotiation. "Of course," Diane agreed smoothly. "We're reasonable people, but the core principle is non-negotiable. Mrs. Reynolds' medical security must be guaranteed without time limits or conditions." After another 30 minutes of legal parrying, we agreed that our respective attorneys would work on revised language, with another meeting scheduled for the following week. As the call concluded, Mark asked for a moment alone with me. "Diane," raised an eyebrow in question, and I nodded, curious despite myself. When our attorneys had disconnected, leaving just Mark and me on the video call, an uncomfortable silence stretched between us. "You look," he finally began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "Like someone fighting cancer without her husband's support?" I supplied, my tone neutral. He had the grace to wince. "I deserve that, and worse." "Yes, you do. I agreed simply. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, Olivia. Not for leaving, I won't lie to you about that, but for the timing, for not handling it better. The inadequacy of his apology might have been laughable if it weren't so painful. 6 months of suffering, of fighting for my life while rebuilding it from the ashes he'd left behind, reduced to regret over timing and handling. Your merger with High Point closes next month, doesn't it? I asked, changing the subject entirely. Mark couldn't hide his surprise. How did you? I still have friends in the financial world, Mark. Friends who didn't abandon me when things got difficult. He absorbed this, recalibrating. Yes, the closing is scheduled for March 15th. Congratulations. I'm sure the $42 million will comfort you whenever your conscience troubles you. You've done your homework, he acknowledged, a hint of his old, appreciative smile appearing. You always were thorough. I'm a scientist. Research is what I do. I paused, then added, speaking of which, Vertex Pharmaceuticals has offered me a position heading their new immunotherapy division. Now his surprise was complete. Vertex, but your treatment. They value my perspective as both researcher and patient. Unlike some people, they see my illness as bringing additional insight, not just limitations. The barb landed precisely where I'd aimed it. They're also offering comprehensive health benefits, though of course I'll still need the security of our trust arrangement, given the unpredictable nature of cancer recurrence. Mark studied me through the screen, something like genuine regret flickering across his features. You're going to be fine without me, aren't you? I already am, I replied with simple honesty. Not because abandonment during cancer was easy to overcome, but because you severely underestimated me, Mark. You always did. His eyes widened slightly at this assessment. During our marriage, I had played the role of supportive spouse so convincingly that perhaps I'd even fooled myself. The accommodating wife, the patient listener, the one who adjusted her ambitions to complement his. I never, he began to protest. You did, I interrupted gently. But it doesn't matter anymore. Have your lawyers send the revised agreement. By Friday, I'd like this chapter of my life closed before my surgery next month. I disconnected before he could respond, sitting back in Diane's plush office chair with an exhaustion that went bone deep. The confrontation had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit, but it had also crystallized something important. I truly was going to be fine without Mark. More than fine, perhaps. That, Diane said, re-entering the room with an approving expression, was masterfully done. Do you think he'll agree? I asked, sipping the water her assistant had thoughtfully provided. After that performance? Absolutely. You struck the perfect balance between reasonable negotiator and potential threat. She gathered her notes efficiently. He'll haggle over details, but you'll get your unrestricted medical trust. He has too. Much at stake not to comply. On the ride home, I gazed out at the Boston streets, still bare from winter's grip, but showing the first hints of coming spring in the quality of the afternoon light. 6 months ago, Mark's abandonment had seemed like the end of everything. Now, incredibly, it was revealing itself as a painful but transformative transition, not just in my health journey, but in my understanding of myself. Claire was waiting. When I arrived home, anxiety written across her face. How did it go? Do you need to lie down? I made soup and... It went well, I interrupted her concerned stream of questions. And yes, I need to rest. But first, I retrieved the Vertex employment contract from my bag. I've decided to accept their offer. Liv, that's incredible! Claire's face lit up with genuine joy. When do you start? They're creating a custom schedule around my treatment and recovery, part-time consulting initially, building to full leadership of the division by fall, assuming my recovery continues, as expected. Of course it will, Claire said with her characteristic certainty. Dr. Sharma said your response to treatment has been exceptional. I settled onto the couch, allowing the fatigue I'd been fighting all day to finally surface. There's something else. Mark is likely to agree to the medical trust. Diane thinks we'll have a final agreement within 2 weeks. Claire sat beside me, squeezing my hand gently. That's everything we hoped for. It is, I agreed, though a strange melancholy had settled over me despite the day's victories. It's just… what? Seeing him today, he looked so normal, so unchanged. While I gestured vaguely at my scarf-covered head, my thin frame, the visible evidence of my struggle. Claire's expression softened with understanding. You've been forged in fire, Liv. He's just the same man he always was, one who runs when things get hard. But you? She shook her head admiringly. You're transformed, stronger, more authentic. Her words echoed my own earlier thoughts so closely that they brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I had been forged in fire, the dual crucible of cancer and abandonment creating something new from what had been broken. As I drifted towards sleep that night, I found myself thinking about the scientific concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections after injury or disease. Perhaps emotional resilience worked the same way, creating new pathways around damaged areas, finding strength in adaptation rather than rigid resistance. Mark had walked away believing he was leaving behind a diminished version of his wife. He couldn't have known that his very abandonment would catalyze a transformation, creating someone stronger and more authentic than the woman who had stood beside him at the altar 6 years earlier. And this new version of me was just beginning to discover her power. The day of my surgery arrived with springtime in Boston. Cherry blossoms lined Commonwealth Avenue, their delicate pink petals offering a stark contrast to the sterile white corridors of Massachusetts General Hospital. After 6 months of grueling chemotherapy, my tumor had shrunk enough for surgical removal, a major milestone in my treatment journey. Claire arrived at dawn to help me prepare, her calm efficiency masking the anxiety I knew she felt. She'd arranged everything meticulously: comfortable clothes for my hospital stay, audiobooks for recovery, a small album of encouraging messages from friends and colleagues. Dr. Sharma says she's optimistic about the margins, Claire reminded me as she drove carefully through early morning traffic. The chemo did exactly what it was supposed to do. I nodded, trying to focus on the positive indicators rather than the risks that accompanied any major surgery. The chemotherapy had been remarkably effective, shrinking the tumor by nearly 80%. My blood markers had improved significantly. My overall health, while still compromised, was better than it had been 2 months ago. Yet fears lingered in the quiet corners of my mind, fears that the surgeon would find more extensive disease than the scans had shown, that the cancer had silently spread to lymph nodes or beyond, that I would wake to worse news than I'd fallen asleep with. As if reading my thoughts, Claire reached across to squeeze my hand. One step at a time, remember? Today is just about getting through the surgery. I know, I replied, squeezing back. I'm ready. The pre-surgical procedures passed in a blur of forms, vital sign checks, and conversations with the surgical team. Dr. Lauren Kessler, my oncological surgeon, visited for a final review of the procedure. Based on your latest scans, I'm planning a lumpectomy with sentinel lymph node biopsy, she explained, her confidence reassuring. If we find unexpected spread, we'll adjust accordingly, but I'm optimistic about preserving breast tissue while achieving clean margins. And recovery time? I asked, thinking of my pending start date at Vertex. Typically 4 to 6 weeks before returning to limited work activities, Dr. Kessler replied. Though knowing your drive, Dr. Reynolds, I suspect you'll be participating in video conferences long before that. Her gentle teasing brought a smile to my face, easing some of the tension. You know scientists make the worst patients. Second only to surgeons, she agreed with a wink, before moving on to explain the anesthesia process. As the surgical team prepared for my procedure, Claire was allowed a final moment with me. She gripped my hand tightly, her usual composure slipping just slightly. "I'll be right here when you wake up," she promised, echoing words that Mark had once spoken before my spine surgery years earlier. Words that had proven empty when I'd awakened alone after that procedure. The parallel wasn't lost on either of us. "I know you will," I replied softly. "You always are." The anesthesiologist's voice was the last thing I remembered. "Count backward from 10, Dr. Reynolds," before darkness claimed me. I made it to 8 before the world dissolved. I awoke gradually, consciousness returning in gentle waves rather than the sharp, nauseated jolt I'd experienced after previous surgeries. A steady beeping filled my ears, the rhythmic sound of monitoring, equipment tracking my vital signs. My chest felt tight, compressed beneath surgical dressings, but the pain was dull rather than sharp, well managed by medications. "She's coming around," a nurse's voice noted, and then Claire's face appeared in my field of vision, her eyes bright with relief. "Hey there," she said softly. Surgery went well. Dr. Kessler got clean margins on the first try, and the sentinel nodes showed no evidence of spread. The news penetrated my fog-filled mind slowly, then all at once. Clean margins. No spread. The best possible outcome. "No mastectomy?" I managed, my voice rough from the intubation tube. "No mastectomy," Claire confirmed. Just as Dr. Kessler hoped, they were able to remove the tumor and preserve breast tissue. Relief washed through me, so profound it brought tears to my eyes. After months of brutal treatments and uncertain prognoses, this clear victory felt almost unreal. The cancer wasn't gone. I still faced radiation therapy and years of hormone blockers, but this critical hurdle had been cleared. Dr. Kessler visited later that evening, reviewing the preliminary pathology results with professional satisfaction. "We'll have complete results in a few days, but everything looks very promising." The tumor response to chemotherapy was excellent, significant necrosis, and clearly defined margins. "What's next?" I asked, more focused now as the anesthesia continued to wear off. "Recovery from surgery first, about 4 weeks. Then we'll begin radiation therapy, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. After that, hormone blockers for at least 5 years to reduce recurrence risk." She studied my face carefully. "One step at a time, Dr. Reynolds. Today's results are worth celebrating." I spent 2 days in the hospital before being discharged to Claire's continued care at home. My recovery proceeded smoothly, better than expected according to Dr. Kessler during my 1-week follow-up appointment. The incision was healing well, my energy slowly returning, my body beginning to rebuild itself after months of punishing. Treatments. 10 days after surgery, as I slowly navigated the stairs of our brownstone, a small victory of recovered mobility, the doorbell rang. Claire answered while I carefully lowered myself onto the living room sofa, still moving gingerly to protect my healing incision. "Delivery for Dr. Reynolds," Claire called, appearing moments later with an enormous arrangement of orchids, my favorite flowers, in a handcrafted ceramic vase. "Who are they from?" I asked, assuming they were from my research team or perhaps my new colleagues at Vertex. Claire checked the card, her expression shifting to surprise, then guarded neutrality. "They're from Mark." I stared at the extravagant arrangement, memories flooding back of other orchids Mark had given me throughout our relationship, celebrating research breakthroughs, anniversaries, the closing on our brownstone. He had always chosen white phalaenopsis, knowing they were my favorite for their elegant simplicity and endurance. "What does the card say?" I asked, uncertain whether I wanted to know. Claire hesitated, then read, "Olivia, heard your surgery went well. Wishing you a smooth recovery. The final trust documents are with Diane for your review. Mark." Such a carefully worded message, acknowledging my health milestone without emotional intimacy, reminding me of the divorce proceedings without explicit mention. maintaining the veneer of concerned civility. Classic Mark, navigating difficult waters. With practiced precision. At least he sent flowers instead of an email, Claire remarked with faint sarcasm, setting the arrangement on a side table. He's fulfilling social obligations, I replied, surprised by my own detachment. 6 months ago, such a gesture might have sparked hope or reopened emotional wounds. Now I viewed it with analytical distance, a data point in the ongoing study of human behavior rather than a source of pain. The following morning brought another delivery, this one from Diane's office. A courier arrived with a thick envelope, containing the final version of our divorce settlement, including the detailed medical trust provisions we had fought for. Mark had indeed agreed to all our core demands, establishing a comprehensive trust that would guarantee my healthcare needs regardless of employment status, insurance market changes, or future relationships. It's finally over, Claire said as we reviewed the documents together at the kitchen table. You won. I considered her words, testing them against my internal landscape. Was it over? Had I won? The divorce, perhaps, the practical legal severance of my ties to Mark, secured on terms that protected my health and future. But the deeper journey felt unfinished, still unfolding in ways I couldn't fully articulate. It's not about winning, I said finally. It's about rebuilding. Mark's signature on the final agreement arrived 3 days later, precisely on schedule. His punctuality, at least, remained consistent. The merger with High Point Capital was set to close the following week, and he clearly wanted our divorce. Finalized before that milestone. Diane called with congratulations, pleased that her strategy had secured the outcome we'd sought. The trust is rock solid, she assured me. His lawyers tried to insert several limiting clauses, but we successfully eliminated all of them. Your medical security is guaranteed, regardless of how your health evolves. I thanked her for her tenacious advocacy, feeling a curious sense of closure as we ended the call. After months of legal maneuvering and emotional turmoil, my marriage was officially over. The woman who had stood in that cathedral 6 years ago, radiantly believing in forever, now existed only in photographs and fading memories. That afternoon, I ventured outside for the first real walk since my surgery, just to the small park 2 blocks from our brownstone, but it felt momentous after weeks of limited mobility. Claire accompanied me, hovering protectively until I laughingly shooed her toward a bench. I need to rebuild my stamina, I insisted. That means actually walking without a human safety net. Spring had fully arrived in Boston, the park vibrant, with fresh green growth and early flowers. I moved slowly along the paved path, savoring the simple pleasure of being outdoors, breathing air scented with hyacinth and newly mown grass. After months of hospital corridors and the familiar confines of our brownstone, even this small park seemed expansive, pulsing with life and possibility. Pausing near a flowering cherry tree, I caught sight of my reflection in a decorative pond. Still thin, my hair just beginning to return in soft inch-long wisps, but standing upright in the spring sunshine, no longer bent by the weight of treatment and betrayal. The image crystallized something I had been feeling gradually over recent weeks. I was emerging, not returning to my former self, that woman was gone, but becoming something new, something forged in the crucible of cancer and abandonment. When I returned to the bench where Claire waited, she looked up from her phone with an expression that immediately put me on alert. "What is it?" I asked, carefully lowering myself beside her. "An email from Dr. Sharma's office. Your final pathology results are ready. She'd like to review them with you tomorrow morning." I nodded, absorbing this news. The comprehensive pathology would provide the clearest picture yet of my cancer status. Whether the surgery had successfully removed all detectable disease, what my recurrence risk factors looked like, how aggressive my ongoing treatment should be. Did they give any indication? I left the question hanging. Claire shook her head. Just the request for an appointment. Standard protocol. That night, I found sleep elusive despite my physical fatigue. The pathology results loomed as another potential turning point, one that could either confirm my healing trajectory or reveal new challenges ahead. By morning, I had prepared myself for either outcome, drawing on the resilience that had become my most valuable asset. Dr. Sharma greeted us with her usual professional warmth when we arrived at her office, ushering us into her consultation room. Rather than an examination room, a small detail that immediately relieved some of my anxiety. Bad news typically came in the clinical setting of exam rooms. Her comfortable office with its expansive windows suggested a different kind of conversation. "The final pathology results are excellent," she began without preamble, knowing my preference for directness. "Complete response to therapy in 2 of the 3 tumor sites, and near-complete response in the 3rd. No lymph node involvement. Clean surgical margins." Claire's hand found mine as Dr. Sharma continued reviewing the detailed findings, explaining what each result meant for my prognosis and ongoing treatment. The technical language provided comforting familiarity: cell markers, necrosis percentages, receptor statuses, transforming the abstract concept of cancer into quantifiable data points that could be measured, tracked, and addressed. "So what does this mean in practical terms?" I asked when she had finished her detailed explanation. "It means your prognosis is very good," Dr. Sharma replied with a genuine smile. "Better than we initially anticipated given the stage at diagnosis. You responded exceptionally well to the chemotherapy regimen, and the surgery was entirely successful. While we can never say with absolute certainty that cancer is cured, your recurrence risk is now significantly reduced." "And the radiation?" I asked, thinking of the 6 weeks of daily treatment still ahead. "Still recommended as a precaution, but we can use a more targeted approach given these results." "And yes," she added, anticipating my next question, "your timeline for returning to work at Vertex should be entirely feasible." As we left the medical center, stepping into the bright spring morning, I felt a profound shift, as if I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale completely. The path ahead still held challenges: radiation treatments, ongoing medications, regular scans and blood tests for years to come. But for the first time since my diagnosis, I could see beyond the immediate battle to the life waiting on the other side. "We should celebrate," Claire declared as we walked toward her car. "A real dinner, not soup, not smoothies. Something decadent at that Italian place you love." "I'd like that," I agreed, surprising myself with the realization that I actually felt hungry. Not just the mechanical need for nutrition that had driven my eating for months, but genuine appetite. Another small sign of returning vitality. As we drove home through the Boston streets, I found myself thinking about Mark's merger, scheduled to close the following day. The timing seemed fitting somehow, his new professional chapter beginning, just as I received confirmation that my health was turning toward recovery. 2 separate lives diverging completely, each moving forward on entirely different paths. The Mark who had abandoned me during my greatest vulnerability could never have imagined this moment. Me, not just surviving, but beginning to thrive again. Rebuilding a life that no longer included him in any meaningful way. In walking away, he had believed he was choosing freedom and self-preservation over the burden of a sick wife. What he couldn't have known was that his leaving would ultimately free me as well, from limitations I hadn't recognized, from compromises I'd made unconsciously, from a relationship that had subtly diminished me even while appearing to elevate us both. "Penny for your thoughts?" Claire asked as we pulled into our driveway. I turned to her with a genuine smile. "I was just thinking that I'm ready for what comes next." My first day at Vertex Pharmaceuticals arrived exactly 7 weeks after my surgery. Radiation treatments had begun 3 weeks earlier, scheduled each morning before I headed to the Cambridge facility where I would lead the company's ambitious new immunotherapy division. The timing was tight but manageable. treatments at 7:30 a.m., at Vertex by 9:20 a.m. for my abbreviated workday, home by mid-afternoon to rest before the cumulative fatigue of radiation could overwhelm me. "Are you absolutely certain you're ready for this?" Claire asked that morning, watching me dress with careful movements, my surgical site still tender beneath the conservative navy suit I'd selected for my first day. "I've been ready for weeks," I replied, adjusting a silk scarf over my still-growing hair. The soft fuzz had come in surprisingly dark, with scattered silver strands that hadn't been there before my treatment, a visible reminder of the journey etched into my very cells. "Dr. Sharma said you should wait until radiation is complete," Claire reminded me, concern evident in her furrowed brow. I met her eyes in the mirror as I applied a touch of lipstick, another small reclamation of normalcy. "Dr. Sharma also said, moderate mental engagement would be beneficial for my recovery, using my brain for something besides monitoring symptoms and side effects. There's a difference between moderate engagement and launching a research division at a major pharmaceutical company," Claire countered, though her tone had softened. "I'm starting at 20 hours a week, with most of those hours dedicated to strategic planning rather than hands-on research." I turned to face her directly. "I need this, Claire. I need to remember who I am beyond cancer and divorce." Understanding replaced concern in her expression. "Of course you do. Just promise you'll listen to your body. Come home early if the fatigue hits. Take breaks." "I promise," I agreed, gathering my new leather portfolio, a gift from Claire to celebrate my professional fresh start. "And you? Have you thought more about Seattle?" Claire had recently received an offer to return to her former company, a generous package that acknowledged both her value and the personal sacrifice she'd made in leaving. But accepting would mean returning to the West Coast, leaving me in Boston to continue my treatment and recovery alone. "I'm not going anywhere until your radiation is complete," she said firmly. "After that, we'll see." I squeezed her hand gently. "You've put your life on hold for almost a year. At some point, you need to resume it, for your sake, not mine." The Vertex campus gleamed in the morning sunshine as my hired car pulled up to the entrance. Catherine Montgomery was waiting in the lobby, elegant in a tailored pantsuit, her warm smile welcoming as she came forward to greet me. "Dr. Reynolds, welcome to Vertex." She extended her hand, her grip firm but careful, as if cognizant of my physical fragility. "We're thrilled to have you joining our team." "Please call me Olivia," I replied, returning her smile. "And thank you for accommodating my rather complicated schedule." "Brilliant minds deserve flexibility," Catherine responded, smoothly, guiding me toward the security desk where my credentials awaited, especially when they bring the unique perspective you offer to our research. The morning passed in a whirlwind of introductions, orientation procedures, and preliminary meetings with key team members. I was struck repeatedly by the respect with which my ideas were received, not despite my illness, but with a recognition that it had granted me insights unavailable to researchers who hadn't experienced cancer treatment from the patient's perspective. "Your suggestion about modified dosing protocols makes perfect sense," Dr. Michael Way, one of the senior researchers, commented during our team meeting. "We've been approaching this from a purely clinical efficiency standpoint, but the quality of life implications you've outlined would make a substantial difference to patients." By early afternoon, fatigue began to creep in, an inevitable side effect of the daily radiation treatments, but the intellectual stimulation of the morning had energized me in ways I hadn't experienced in nearly a year. As Catherine walked me back to the lobby where my car waited, I felt a profound sense of rightness, of pieces clicking into place after months of dislocation. "Tomorrow we'll review the current research portfolio in more detail," Catherine said as we reached the entrance. "Unless you'd prefer to start with the organizational structure first?" "The research," I decided immediately. "I want to understand what we're working with before discussing who's doing what." She nodded approvingly. I thought you might say that. The files will be ready in your secure database tonight if you want to preview them. Thank you, Catherine. For everything. The words encompassed more than just her professional courtesy. They acknowledged the rare opportunity she had extended. To me, at a time when many companies would have seen only liability in hiring a cancer patient in active treatment. We didn't hire you out of charity, Olivia, she replied, seeming to read my thoughts. We hired you because cancer research needs more leaders who understand both the science and the stakes on a personal level. Your experience isn't a liability. It's your greatest asset to us. As my car navigated the afternoon traffic back to Beacon Hill, I reflected on Catherine's words. For months, cancer had defined me primarily through loss of health, of independence, of marriage, of professional momentum. Now, remarkably, it was being reframed as a source of value, an experience that enhanced rather than diminished my contribution. The conceptual shift reminded me of kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, treating damage as part of an object's history rather than something to disguise. Perhaps my own breaking and mending could be similarly transformed, the golden seams of my experience becoming their own kind of strength and beauty. Claire was waiting when I arrived home, trying and failing to look casual as she assessed my condition. How was it? Wonderful, I replied truthfully, easing onto the sofa with a sigh of relief. The day had been exhilarating but taxing. It felt good to use my brain for something besides keeping track of medications and side effects. You look tired, but happy, Claire observed, bringing me a cup of ginger tea, still a staple for managing the mild nausea that accompanied radiation. I am both, I agreed, sipping the soothing liquid. How was your video interview with Seattle? Claire had mentioned the call in passing that morning, another step in her tentative exploration of returning to her former position. She shrugged non-committally. Standard stuff. They want me back by August if possible. That's perfect timing, I noted. My radiation will be finished in July. You could help me settle into a post-treatment routine and then head west with perfect timing for Seattle's best weather. Claire smiled faintly at my transparent attempt to make her departure seem like optimal timing rather than abandonment. We'll see. A lot depends on your next scan results. Which will be excellent, I predicted with more confidence than I truly felt. Just like the pathology after surgery, the remainder of the evening passed quietly as I reviewed research files from Vertex, making notes for the following days. Meetings. Despite the physical fatigue, my mind felt sharper than it had in months, eager to engage with complex scientific problems again. When I finally closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I realized I had gone nearly 6 hours without thinking about Mark or the divorce, the longest such stretch since his departure. Progress came in unexpected forms. The pattern established that first day continued through the following weeks, radiation treatments each morning, abbreviated but productive workdays at Vertex, quiet evenings of recovery at home. The rhythm brought welcome structure after months of medical appointments and uncertainty dominating my calendar. Radiation side effects accumulated gradually, fatigue that deepened week by week, reddening skin at the treatment site, occasional breathlessness when climbing stairs. But compared to the devastation of chemotherapy, these challenges felt manageable, mere inconveniences rather than life-altering burdens. 3 weeks into my new position, as I was reviewing preliminary data from a promising combination therapy trial, my direct line at Vertex rang. Few people had the number, making the call unusual enough to capture my full attention. Dr. Reynolds, speaking, I answered, expecting perhaps Dr. Sharma's office with a schedule change or Catherine with a question about the research review I'd submitted the previous day. Olivia. Mark's voice, instantly recognizable despite our months of separation, sent an unexpected jolt through me. I hope I'm not interrupting. Mark. I kept my tone neutral, professional. This is unexpected. I know. I apologize for Calling you at work. A brief pause. I heard from mutual friends that you'd taken a position at Vertex. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied, wondering at his purpose. Our divorce had been finalized months ago, the medical trust established, and functioning, all practical ties between us severed. Is there something specific you need? Another pause, longer this time. Yes, actually. There is. His voice held an unfamiliar note, hesitation, perhaps even vulnerability. I need to meet with you, in person, if possible. I don't think that's necessary, I said carefully. If there's an issue with the trust, your attorneys can contact Diane. It's not about trust. He sounded frustrated now, though whether with me or himself was unclear. It's personal and urgent. Something in his tone gave me pause. During our 6-year marriage, I had rarely heard Mark sound uncertain. His confidence, sometimes bordering on arrogance, had been one of his defining characteristics. This hesitancy was new and therefore intriguing. I'm quite busy with treatment and my new position, I replied, not yet agreeing but not refusing outright. What exactly is this regarding? I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, Mark said. Could we meet briefly? Perhaps coffee somewhere? Public near your office? Curiosity warred with self-protection. After all Mark had done, I owed him nothing, certainly not my time or attention. Yet something in his unusual manner suggested genuine urgency rather than manipulation. I have a full schedule this week, I said finally. I could spare 30 minutes next Tuesday after my radiation treatment. There's a cafe near Massachusetts General where I usually have breakfast. Thank you. The relief in his voice was palpable. I appreciate it, Olivia. Truly. After we disconnected, I sat still for several moments, trying to process my own reactions. A year ago, such a call would have sent me into emotional turmoil, hope and hurt, battling for dominance. Now I felt primarily curiosity, with perhaps a touch of wariness. The emotional maelstrom that had once defined my relationship with Mark had subsided to ripples rather than waves. I didn't mention the call to Claire that evening, not wanting to spark her protective outrage or cause her concern. Whatever Mark wanted, I was confident in my ability to maintain boundaries and protect my well-being. The woman who had once organized her life around his preferences and needs no longer existed. The weekend passed peacefully with no further contact. From Mark. I divided my time between rest, review of Vertex research protocols, and a tentative return to yoga, modified for my post-surgical limitations, but still restorative. By Monday, the upcoming meeting with Mark had receded to a background curiosity rather than a preoccupation. A text arrived Tuesday morning as I was preparing to leave for radiation. Confirming our meeting, 9 a.m. at Beacon Cafe? Mark, I replied, with a simple yes before heading out into the June sunshine. My radiation session proceeded as usual, the technicians now familiar and friendly, the procedure routine despite its inherent strangeness. Afterward, I walked the short distance to Beacon Cafe, my body tired but my mind alert with curiosity about what Mark could possibly want that required an in-person meeting. I spotted him immediately upon entering, seated at a corner table with 2 coffee cups already waiting, looking both familiar and strangely foreign in his tailored suit. The merger with High Point had clearly been prosperous. His custom-made shirt and designer watch spoke of financial success beyond even his previous considerable wealth. He stood as I approached, his expression difficult to read. Olivia, thank you for coming. His eyes moved over me assessingly, taking in the changes in my appearance. The short, salt-and-pepper hair that had replaced my once-long chestnut waves, the weight I hadn't fully regained, the careful way I moved to accommodate lingering surgical tenderness. You said it was urgent, I replied, taking the seat across from him. I have about 25 minutes before I need to head to Cambridge. Mark nodded, seeming uncharacteristically nervous as he pushed a cappuccino toward me. I remembered your preferred morning coffee. My tastes have changed, I said, though I accepted the drink nonetheless. Chemotherapy alters many things, including palate. He winced slightly at the reference, then squared his shoulders as if bracing himself. I'll get straight to the point. I need your help, Olivia. Specifically, I need your signature on an addendum to our medical trust agreement. I raised an eyebrow, immediately wary. The terms were finalized months ago. Why would they need modification now? Mark took a deep breath. Because I need to access the coverage myself. You need to access the coverage? I repeated, certain I had misheard him. The trust was established specifically for my cancer treatment and ongoing care. Mark stared down at his untouched coffee, a muscle working in his jaw. The irony isn't lost on me, believe me. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. Are you saying... I've been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, he said, finally meeting my eyes. Metastasized to the liver already. The prognosis is... not good. The words hung between us, as surreal as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. Mark, vital, ambitious, seemingly indestructible Mark, with advanced cancer? The man who had walked away from me because he couldn't face my illness was now facing a diagnosis statistically far more dire than mine had been. When? I managed. After several moments of stunned silence. I started having digestive issues about 2 months ago. Ignored them at first, blamed it on stress from the merger. He gave a bitter laugh. By the time I couldn't ignore the symptoms anymore, it had already spread. I struggled to process this information, my scientist's mind automatically assessing the implications, while my emotions remained curiously suspended, as if waiting for instruction on how to respond. I don't understand, I said finally. You have excellent health insurance through High Point. Why would you need access to the trust established for my care? Mark shifted uncomfortably. That's where it gets complicated. The merger agreement included a private health insurance plan for executives, premium coverage, supposedly better than standard corporate plans. But it turns out there's a pre-existing condition clause with a 6-month waiting period. Understanding dawned slowly. And since your symptoms started before the merger was finalized, exactly. My diagnosis falls into a coverage gap. The treatment protocol recommended by Dana-Farber is considered experimental for my specific genetic markers. Standard insurance won't cover it, and the executive plan excludes it as a pre-existing condition until the waiting period expires. By which time? I didn't finish the sentence. We both knew the grim math of aggressive pancreatic cancer. 6 months could mean the difference between possible remission and no chance at all. The trust we established has exceptional coverage for advanced stage experimental treatments, Mark continued. But as currently written, it specifically names you as the sole beneficiary. I sat back, the irony of the situation washing over me in waves. The medical trust Mark had been forced to establish to secure his comfortable exit from our marriage, the provision he had most resisted during our divorce negotiations, was now potentially his best hope for accessing cutting-edge treatment. You need my signature to amend the trust to include you as a beneficiary, I summarized, my voice remarkably steady despite the emotional earthquake reshaping the landscape between us. Yes. The single word seemed to cost him considerable effort. I wouldn't ask if there were any other option. I studied him more carefully now, noticing details that had escaped my initial observation. The slight yellowish tint to his complexion that suggested liver involvement, the way his suit jacket hung somewhat loosely on his frame, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant pain. Who's managing your care? I asked, my clinical mind engaging even as emotions remained suspended. Dr. Eleanor Kim at Dana-Farber. She's developed a targeted immunotherapy protocol for KRAS-mutated tumors like mine. Early trials show promising results, but it's still classified as experimental. I nodded, recognizing the researcher's name. Dr. Kim's work was well respected in oncology circles, innovative without being reckless. If she believed the protocol offered hope, it likely represented Mark's best chance, slim though it might be. The treatment costs approximately $425,000. Mark continued, watching me carefully. Insurance will cover the standard protocol, which offers a median survival of about 7 months, but not Dr. Kim's approach. 7 months. The number hung in the air between us, stark and unforgiving. Mark was 37 years old. This is a lot to process, I said finally, glancing at my watch. 20 minutes had passed. I would need to leave soon for Vertex. I need time to think. I understand, he replied quickly. But time is somewhat precious at the moment. The understatement might have been darkly humorous if the situation weren't so grave. I gathered my purse and light jacket, preparing to leave. I'll contact Diane today, have her review the legal implications, I said, standing carefully to avoid, triggering the dizziness that sometimes followed radiation. I'll let you know my decision soon. Mark stood as well, uncertainty written across features that had once been so confidently familiar to me. Thank you for considering it, for even hearing me out. I nodded once, then turned to leave, my mind already racing with the implications of his request. At the door, I paused, looking back at him still standing beside our table, suddenly appearing smaller somehow against the bustling background of the morning cafe. "Mark," I called softly. "I'm sorry about your diagnosis. Truly." Something flickered across his face. Gratitude, perhaps, or simple recognition of the genuine sentiment behind my words. He nodded once, and I stepped out into the June sunshine, the world around me seemingly unchanged despite the seismic revelation of our brief meeting. My driver was waiting to take me to Vertex, the familiar routine continuing despite the extraordinary circumstances. As we navigated Boston traffic, I called Diane's office, arranging an urgent consultation for that evening. Next, I contacted Dr. Sharma, requesting her professional insight on the treatment protocol Mark had mentioned. Only after these practical matters were arranged did I allow myself to begin processing the emotional dimensions of what had just occurred. The universe, it seemed, had a darkly poetic sense of symmetry. The man who had walked away from in sickness and in health was now desperately ill himself, turning to the very woman he had abandoned for assistance. Justice, karma, cosmic retribution, whatever one might call it, had arrived with devastating precision. Yet the victory tasted like ashes in my mouth. By the time I arrived at Vertex, I had composed myself enough to function professionally, compartmentalizing Mark's situation while I focused on the day's research reviews. Years of scientific training had equipped me with the ability to separate emotional reactions from intellectual analysis, a skill that served me well now. "Are you all right?" Catherine asked during our afternoon meeting, her perceptive gaze noting something in my demeanor despite my efforts at normalcy. "You seem distracted today." "Just some unexpected personal news," I replied, redirecting our attention to the protein marker data displayed on the conference room screen. "Nothing that can't wait until after we finish this analysis." The remainder of my abbreviated workday passed in a fog of technical discussions and strategic planning, my mind performing the necessary functions while a deeper part of me grappled with the decision awaiting me at home. By the time my driver delivered me back to Beacon Hill, fatigue had settled into my bones, both from radiation and from the emotional weight of the morning's revelation. Claire was out, attending a job interview with a Boston tech firm, one of several local options. She was exploring as a compromise between returning to Seattle and remaining near me during my recovery. Her absence gave me welcome space to think without immediately navigating her protective outrage, which would inevitably flare when she learned of Mark's request. Diane arrived promptly at 5, leather portfolio in hand, her expression suggesting She had already reviewed the legal considerations of Mark's proposal. "This is unprecedented," she began after settling in my living room. "Amending a medical trust post-divorce to include the ex-spouse who insisted on its creation in the first place." She shook her head, professional composure momentarily giving way to incredulity. "In 24 years of practice, I've never encountered anything quite like it." "What are the legal implications?" I asked, accepting the tea she had thoughtfully brought from the bakery near her office, aware of my continued sensitivity to the smell of coffee during radiation. From a purely legal perspective, it's straightforward. The trust was established, with you as the beneficiary, but with provisions allowing amendments with your written consent. There's nothing preventing you from adding Mark as a beneficiary, either temporarily or permanently. And the financial impact? That's where it gets more complex, Diane acknowledged, flipping through her notes. The trust was funded at $4.8 million, an amount calculated to cover your potential medical needs for approximately 20 years, including experimental treatments if necessary. Adding a second beneficiary with immediate significant expenses would obviously reduce the funds available for your future care, especially with the kind of treatment costs Mark mentioned, I noted. Exactly. Dr. Kim's protocol alone would consume nearly 10% of the total trust. Then there are hospitalization costs, supportive care, potential complications. She let the implications hang unspoken. What if I agreed to a temporary amendment, limited to this specific treatment course? Diane considered this. That's possible. We could structure an amendment that provides coverage specifically for Dr. Kim's protocol and directly related care, with a financial cap and expiration date. I nodded, sipping my tea thoughtfully. That seems reasonable. It would provide Mark access to the treatment he needs without compromising my long-term security. Olivia. Diane set aside her legal pad, her expression softening from professional to personal. Before we discuss specific terms, I feel obligated to remind you that you have absolutely no legal or moral obligation to help Mark. This man walked out when you were at your most vulnerable. He abandoned you during cancer treatment. The trust exists precisely because he tried to escape financial responsibility for your care. I know, I replied quietly. Many people in your position would see his current situation as, well, as justified cosmic retribution. No one would blame you for declining his request. I set down my teacup, considering her words. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mark, who couldn't bear to watch me endure cancer treatment, now facing a diagnosis far more dire than mine had been. The symmetry had a certain poetic justice that might have satisfied a younger, less experienced version of myself. But cancer had taught me a perspective that transcended petty satisfaction. I had stared into the abyss of my own mortality, felt the cold touch of a life potentially cut short, experienced the profound isolation of facing death without the support I had counted on. Those lessons couldn't be unlearned, even for the man who had inflicted that isolation. What would refusing accomplish? I asked softly. Would it undo my suffering? Restore the months I spent wondering how someone who vowed to love me could leave when I needed him most? Diane remained silent, allowing me space to process aloud. Denying. Mark access to potentially life-saving treatment wouldn't heal my wounds, I continued. It would just create new suffering. Different suffering, but suffering nonetheless. You've always had a remarkable capacity for compassion, Diane observed. Even now, after everything he did. It's not about compassion for Mark specifically, I clarified. It's about who I want to be. The woman he left would have signed the amendment immediately, desperate for his approval and gratitude. The woman I've become signs it because she understands suffering too intimately to inflict it on others, even those who have hurt her. Diane nodded slowly. Then let's draft an amendment that protects your interests while providing the coverage he needs. Limited scope, specific timeline, clear financial boundaries. We spent the next hour outlining the terms of a temporary amendment to the medical trust, one that would allow Mark access to Dr. Kim's experimental protocol and related supportive care, with a financial cap of $600,000 and a 6-month time limit. The provisions were generous yet pragmatic, offering Mark the chance he needed without compromising my future security. As Diane prepared to leave, promising to have formal documents ready the following day, she paused at the door. "You're a better person than most, Olivia, including me. I'm not sure I could be so magnanimous in your position." "It's not magnanimity," I replied truthfully. "It's just clarity. Cancer strips away the non-essential. In the face of mortality, his or mine, our history seems less significant than the possibility of saving a life." After Diane departed, I sat alone in the growing twilight, watching as gold-tinged sunlight gradually faded from my living room. The day had brought a reversal I could never have imagined when Mark walked out 10 months earlier. Him turning to me for literal survival, me holding the power to grant or withhold it. Yet the power dynamic that might once have seemed like vindication now felt merely like responsibility, a weight rather than a weapon. The realization reinforced something I had been sensing throughout my recovery. My healing extended beyond the physical remission of cancer cells. It encompassed a profound psychological realignment, a shift from seeking external validation to finding internal alignment with my deepest values. When Claire returned home an hour later, flushed with excitement from a successful interview, I steeled myself to share the day's developments. Her reaction, as expected, combined disbelief and protective fury. "He what?" she exclaimed, pacing the living room after I explained Mark's diagnosis and request. "The absolute audacity after what he did to you." "It's not about audacity, Claire. It's about survival." "No, it's about karmic justice finally catching up with him," she countered, her eyes flashing. "And now he wants you to save him? Please tell me you laughed in his face." "I'm going to sign the amendment," I said quietly. "With protective limitations, but yes, I'm going to help him access the treatment." Claire stopped pacing, staring at me in genuine confusion. "Why? After everything he put you through, why would you help him?" I considered how to explain a decision that stemmed not from forgiveness or weakness, but from a perspective transformed by confronting my own mortality. "Because cancer taught me that suffering isn't something anyone deserves," I said finally. "Not even Mark." 2 days after my meeting with Mark, I signed the amended trust documents in Diane's downtown office. The terms were precisely as we had discussed: access to funding specifically for Dr. Kim's experimental protocol, with a $600,000 cap and 6-month limitation. The amendment included comprehensive reporting requirements to prevent misuse and protect the trust's primary purpose of securing my long-term medical needs. "I've added language requiring quarterly medical reports," Diane explained as I reviewed the final paperwork. "That way we can verify the funds are being used specifically for the approved treatment protocol." "Is that standard practice?" I asked, scanning the detailed conditions. "No," she admitted. "But given the circumstances, additional oversight seems prudent." I nodded, appreciating her continued vigilance on my behalf, even as I had chosen to help. Mark. Trust and verification could coexist, another lesson hard-earned through my cancer journey. After signing the necessary documents, I felt a curious sense of closure, as if this final interaction with Mark had completed some unfinished emotional business between us. The amendment would provide him access to cutting-edge treatment without requiring ongoing personal contact. Our paths, which had diverged so painfully 10 months earlier, could remain separate despite this brief intersection. "You'll send these to Mark's attorneys?" I confirmed, watching Diane gather the signed papers. "Immediately," she assured me. "The trust administrator will receive instructions to authorize payment for Dr. Kim's protocol as soon as the paperwork is processed." "Thank you, Diane, for everything." The simple words encompassed far more than this final legal arrangement. They acknowledged her unwavering support throughout the divorce, her strategic brilliance in securing the medical trust that now, ironically, would benefit both Mark and me. "You're welcome," she replied with a smile that softened her usually formidable demeanor. Though I must admit, when we established this trust, I never imagined it would eventually help the man who walked away during your treatment. Life specializes in unexpected plot twists, I observed. Cancer taught me that, if nothing else. I expected that to be the end of it. Papers signed, amendment filed, legal obligations fulfilled. But as I was leaving Vertex 2 days later, I found Mark waiting beside my car, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I hope you don't mind," he said, straightening from where he'd been leaning against the vehicle. "Catherine mentioned you usually. Finish around 4 on treatment days." I felt a flicker of irritation that he'd sought out information about my schedule, but it faded quickly. Mark looked markedly worse than he had during our cafe meeting. Thinner, his skin more obviously, jaundiced, dark circles prominent beneath his eyes. Cancer was advancing rapidly, exactly as pancreatic malignancies were known to do. "Is something wrong with the paperwork?" I asked, unlocking my car but not immediately getting in. "No, everything's proceeding. The trust administrator has already contacted Dr. Kim's office." He shifted his weight, wincing slightly. "I wanted to thank you in person. I know you had every reason to refuse." I studied him, trying to reconcile this humble, physically diminished version of Mark with the confident, ambitious man who had been my husband. Cancer was the great equalizer, stripping away pretense and privilege, reducing complex human beings to their essential core. "You're welcome," I replied simply. "Dr. Kim's protocol offers your best chance. The decision wasn't difficult from a medical perspective." "But from a personal perspective?" he pressed, his eyes searching mine. "After what I did?" I considered my answer carefully, aware that this might be one of our final conversations. Mark's prognosis, even with cutting-edge treatment, remained grim. The 5-year survival rate for stage 4 pancreatic cancer hovered around 3%, a statistic we both understood all too well. From a personal perspective, I've learned that holding on to anger requires energy I'd rather direct elsewhere, I said finally. "Energy is a limited resource during cancer treatment, as you're discovering." He nodded, accepting both the insight and the gentle rebuke it contained. "I've been thinking a lot about energy lately, about choices, about what matters when time becomes constrained." "That's one of cancer's unexpected gifts," I acknowledged. "Clarified priorities." "I made the wrong choice, Olivia." The words emerged suddenly, as if he'd been holding them back with effort. "Leaving you during your treatment, it was unforgivable. I see that now." I felt a curious detachment from this confession that once would have meant everything to me. The validation that yes, his abandonment had been morally wrong, that my pain had been justified. It arrived too late to matter in the way it once might have. "Why did you do it?" I asked, genuinely curious now that enough time had passed to dull the sharp edges of betrayal. "Was it really just fear?" Mark leaned against my car again, the movement suggesting standing had become difficult for him. "Fear was part of it. Seeing you so ill, so vulnerable, it confronted me with mortality in a way I wasn't equipped to handle." "Most people manage to overcome that fear when someone they love is suffering," I observed, not unkindly but factually. "I know." He looked away, watching Vertex employees stream toward the parking lot as the workday ended. But there was something else, something I couldn't articulate until I was diagnosed myself. "What?" "Shame." The admission seemed to cost him significant effort. Not about your illness, but about my response to it. From the first day in Dr. Sharma's office, I felt inadequate, frozen. Everyone expected me to be your rock, your advocate, your protector. But I had no idea how to do that. Each time I failed, when I couldn't stop your pain, couldn't fix the situation, Couldn't even find the right words. The shame grew. I listened silently, seeing our shared history through a new lens. I told myself I was leaving for your benefit, he continued. That Claire was better at supporting you anyway. That my discomfort was making everything harder for you. But that was self-deception. I left because I couldn't bear my own inadequacy. The explanation offered a new perspective on what I had experienced as simple abandonment. Not that it justified his actions. Nothing could. But it reframed them, within a more complex emotional landscape than I had previously allowed. And now? I asked. Now I understand what it's like to wake up every morning knowing your body is betraying you. To face treatments that might save you, or might just make your remaining time more miserable. His smile was grim. Quite the education. An uncomfortable silence settled between us, filled with the weight of shared yet divergent experiences. We had both faced cancer's harsh reality, but from very different positions. With Claire's unwavering support, he was apparently alone. Is someone helping you? I asked suddenly, realizing I had no idea who was managing his care beyond the medical. Tim, during treatments and recovery? A shadow crossed his face. I have a health aide who comes daily. Cassandra tried for a while, but... He shrugged. She wasn't prepared for the reality of cancer care. Cassandra, the woman Mark had begun seeing shortly after our separation, according to mutual friends, who thought I should know. I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction that she had proven equally incapable of honoring in sickness and in health, but it dissipated quickly. Who was I to judge her limitations when they mirrored Mark's own? Cancer caregiving is challenging, I acknowledged neutrally. Not everyone has the capacity for it. Claire was extraordinary, Mark said unexpectedly. I used to watch her with you during your treatments before I left. She never flinched, never seemed overwhelmed. She put her entire life on hold for me, I agreed, a wave of gratitude for my sister washing over me. Not everyone has a Claire. No, Mark agreed quietly. Not everyone deserves one. His candor surprised me, suggesting a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected. Perhaps facing his own mortality had stripped away the protective layers of self-justification, leaving only honest acknowledgement of his failings. I should let you go, he said after another moment of silence. The treatments are exhausting, I know. Yes, I agreed, fatigue beginning to weigh on me as the day's radiation effects accumulated. I need to rest before my evening call with the research team. He straightened with visible effort. Thank you again, Olivia. Not just for the trust amendment, but for hearing me out today, for giving me more than I deserve. As he turned to leave, I was struck by a sudden realization. This might be the last time I saw Mark alive. Pancreatic cancer moved with brutal efficiency, and despite Dr. Kim's innovative protocol, the odds remained starkly against him. The thought stirred an unexpected emotion. Not grief exactly, but a somber recognition of life's fragility, of opportunities lost and paths not taken. Mark? I called as he reached his car several spaces away. He turned, his expression questioning. If you need anything, medical advocacy, second opinions, research access, you can contact me. Cancer is difficult enough without navigating it alone. Something flickered across his face. Gratitude mingled with regret, perhaps even shame at requiring help from the very person he had abandoned. I appreciate that, he said simply, then got into his car and drove away. I watched until his car disappeared from view, reflecting on the strange symmetry of our situations. 10 months earlier, he had walked away from my cancer battle, believing himself incapable of facing such difficulty. Now he confronted his own diagnosis largely alone, while I stood on the other side of treatment, not fully recovered, but well enough to offer assistance I had once desperately needed from him. The universe's sense of justice, it seemed, had a complexity that transcended simple retribution. When I arrived home, Claire was preparing dinner, a fragrant curry designed to appeal to my radiation-altered palate, which struggled with bland foods but could still appreciate bold spices. She took one look at my expression and set down her spoon. What happened? I sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. I saw Mark today. He was waiting after work to thank me for the trust amendment. And? Claire prompted, her protective instincts visibly on alert. And he looks terrible. The cancer is progressing rapidly. I described our conversation, including Mark's reflections on why he had left during my treatment. Claire listened skeptically. Convenient insights now that he needs your help. Maybe, I acknowledged. Or maybe facing his own mortality has provided a genuine perspective. Either way, it doesn't change the past. No, it doesn't. Claire returned to stirring the curry, her movements slightly more forceful than necessary. Did he apologize? Actually, say the words, "I'm sorry for abandoning you when you needed me most." I thought back over our conversation. Not explicitly, no. He said it was unforgivable, that he made the wrong choice. But no, not a direct apology. Claire snorted. Typical Mark, self-reflection without accountability. Her assessment wasn't entirely fair, but I understood its source. Claire had witnessed my suffering firsthand, had held my hair during violent post-chemo vomiting, changed my surgical dressings, helped me shower when I was too weak to stand alone. Her anger on my behalf came from deep love and fierce protection. He's dying, Claire, I said quietly. Probably within months, even with the experimental treatment. Her expression softened slightly. I know. And I don't wish that on anyone, even him. But understanding why he left doesn't erase what his living cost you. No, I agreed. It doesn't. Later that evening, after dinner and a brief yoga session modified for my radiation fatigue, I sat in the small office that had once been Mark's domain and was now my workplace at home. My conversation with him lingered in my thoughts, reshaping my understanding of our shared past and divergent present. Perhaps the most profound realization was how completely I had moved beyond needing Mark's recognition of his failures. The validation I had once craved, that yes, his abandonment had been wrong. Yes, my pain had been justified, now seemed almost irrelevant. I had built a new life from the ashes of his betrayal, one that no longer orbited around his presence or absence. My finger hovered over my phone, considering whether to message Catherine about a research question that had occurred to me during dinner. Instead, I found myself opening the contact information for Dr. Kim that Diane had included in the trust amendment paperwork. After a moment's hesitation, I composed a brief, professional email. Dr. Kim, as the primary beneficiary of the medical trust now funding Mark Reynolds' treatment under your protocol, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm a biomedical researcher specializing in targeted protein therapies, currently heading immunotherapy development at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. If my professional background or personal experience as a cancer patient could provide any insights beneficial to Mark's treatment, please don't hesitate to contact me. I included my credentials and contact information, then sent the message before I could second-guess the impulse. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. That would require a more direct acknowledgement of harm than Mark had offered. But it was something adjacent to forgiveness, a willingness to contribute positively where I could without requiring emotional reconciliation first. Cancer had taught me that life was too precious and too precarious to waste on resentment, even justified resentment. The woman I had become understood that healing sometimes meant releasing the expectation of perfect justice or complete restoration, not for Mark's benefit, but for my own. 3 weeks later, my radiation treatments concluded with little ceremony, just a gentle chime from the machine, a round of applause from the technicians who had become friendly faces over the 6-week course, and a certificate of completion that seemed almost comically inadequate for the ordeal. That's it? Claire asked as we left the hospital together, looking almost disappointed by the anticlimactic ending. That's it, I confirmed, stepping into the July sunshine with a lightness I hadn't felt in over a year. No more daily hospital visits, just monthly checkups and hormone therapy. We should celebrate, she declared, linking her arm through mine. Something more significant than just dinner out. This is a milestone. I smiled at her enthusiasm. What did you have in mind? I was thinking Maine. Her expression turned tentative. The oceanfront cottage we used to rent in Ogunquit. A week of sea air, reading on the porch, watching the tide. Doctor-approved recuperation. The suggestion stirred memories of family vacations long before cancer or Mark. Claire and I walking the marginal way, collecting shells at low tide, eating lobster rolls at the small dockside restaurant. Simple pleasures from what felt like another lifetime. That sounds perfect, I agreed, surprising her with my immediate acceptance. When can we go? Really? Claire's face lit up. I already reserved it, starting this weekend. I was prepared to argue extensively about how you need proper rest after radiation. I laughed, the sound unfamiliar, but welcome. No argument necessary. I could use some sea air and sisterly company before you head back to Seattle. Claire's expression shifted subtly. About that, I've been meaning to tell you. I accepted the position with Tech Foundry here in Boston. I start next month. Claire! I stopped walking, turning to face her directly. What about your VP position in Seattle? The apartment you love? Your whole West Coast life? She shrugged. Attempting casual dismissal through her eyes revealed deeper emotion. Turns out I like the East Coast too. Tech Foundry made an excellent offer, and the work is actually more aligned with my long-term career goals. Are you staying because of me? I asked directly. Because you're worried about my recovery? I'm staying because this past year changed me too, Liv. Her voice softened. Not just you. Watching you fight through cancer with such grace and determination, it shifted my perspective on what matters. And right now, being near my sister matters more than a specific job title or city view. Tears welled unexpectedly in my eyes. I don't want to be the reason you give up what you've built. You're not, she insisted. You're the reason I've recognized what's truly valuable. The job is excellent, the compensation comparable. I'm not sacrificing. I'm choosing. We continued walking toward the parking garage, her decision settling. Between us, another sign that life was realigning after cancer's disruption, finding new patterns rather than simply returning to old ones. As Claire drove us home, my phone chimed with an incoming email. I glanced at it, expecting a message from Vertex colleagues about the research presentation scheduled for the following week. Instead, I saw Dr. Eleanor Kim's name in the sender field. Dr. Reynolds, the message began. Thank you for your offer of consultation regarding Mark's case. I'd like to take you up on that if the offer still stands. We're seeing some unusual immune responses to the protocol that align with research areas you've published on recently. Would you be available to review some anonymized data and provide insights? I believe your unique perspective as both scientist and patient could be valuable. Claire glanced over as I read the email. Work emergency? Not exactly, I replied, scanning the detailed technical questions Dr. Kim had included. Remember when I told you I'd offered to consult on Mark's treatment if needed? His oncologist is taking me up on it. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Are you okay with that? Being involved in his treatment? I considered the question carefully. Yes, actually. It feels appropriate somehow. Full circle. Just be careful about boundaries, Claire cautioned. You've worked too hard at rebuilding. To let Mark's needs consume you again. This is professional consultation, not personal caretaking, I assured her. And honestly, the immune response markers Dr. Kim describes are fascinating from a research perspective. They relate directly to work we're doing at Vertex. I composed a brief reply to Dr. Kim, suggesting a video consultation the following week after I returned from Maine. As I sent the message, I realized I felt no emotional turmoil about becoming involved in Mark's treatment, just professional curiosity and a calm willingness to contribute where my expertise might help. The Maine cottage proved exactly the respite both Claire and I needed. Nestled on a rocky bluff overlooking the Atlantic, the simple cedar-shingled structure offered panoramic ocean views, salt-scented breezes, and blessed distance from the medical facilities that had dominated my life for the past year. Each morning, I woke to sunrise over the water, wrapped in a thick blanket on the porch swing as I sipped herbal tea and watched lobster boats heading out for their day's work. My body, freed from the daily assault of radiation, began to recover more rapidly than I had expected, energy returning incrementally, appetite improving, the persistent brain fog finally lifting. "You look better every day," Claire observed, as we walked the beach on our fifth afternoon, collecting smooth stones and sea glass. "There's color in your cheeks again." "I feel better," I agreed, bending to retrieve a perfect spiral shell half buried in wet sand. "More like myself, or rather like this new version of myself." "New and improved," Claire quipped, but her eyes were serious. "You know that, right? That everything you've been through has made you stronger in ways that matter?" I considered this. As we continued along the shoreline, waves lapping at our bare feet. Not stronger in the triumphalist sense that people often apply to cancer survivors. That never resonated with me. The warrior metaphors, the battle language. Then how? Clearer, I decided after a thoughtful pause. More aligned with what truly matters to me. Less concerned with external validation. More willing to acknowledge both my limitations and my worth. Claire nodded. "I've seen it. The way you navigated the Vertex opportunity, the divorce negotiations, even Mark's diagnosis. There's a centeredness to you now that wasn't there before." "Cancer strips away pretense," I observed, watching seagulls wheel overhead. "When you're facing mortality, cultural expectations and social performances suddenly seem absurd. Why waste energy on them when you might have so little left?" The consultation with Dr. Kim took place my first day back from Maine, conducted via secure video conference from my home office. She presented anonymized data from Mark's treatment, remarkable immune activation patterns following the experimental protocol, suggesting his body was mounting an unusually robust response to the targeted therapy. "These NK cell profiles are fascinating," I noted, examining the flow cytometry results. "They resemble response patterns we're seeing in our triple-negative breast cancer trials, despite the completely different cancer type." "Exactly," Dr. Kim agreed, her professional excitement evident. "It suggests a cross-applicability we hadn't anticipated. Your recent paper on immunomodulation pathways got me thinking about potential mechanisms." For the next hour, we engaged in the kind of intense scientific discussion that had always energized me. Hypothesizing, analyzing, drawing connections between seemingly disparate data points. Cancer in this context transformed from personal trauma to intellectual puzzle, from enemy to complex biological system that could be understood and potentially outmaneuvered. Based on these markers, I concluded, I'd be cautiously optimistic about continued response. The protocol is clearly triggering the cellular pathways we want to see activated. Dr. Kim nodded thoughtfully. "My assessment as well. We're seeing actual tumor shrinkage on the most recent scans. Not cure, certainly, but meaningful response. It's buying time. Time. The commodity that had seemed so cruelly limited when Mark received his diagnosis. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me that the trust he had resisted establishing for my care was now providing him precisely what he had sought by leaving: more time. "Would it be appropriate for me to ask how he's doing overall?" I inquired, shifting from scientific to personal terrain with some hesitation. Beyond the clinical response data, Dr. Kim considered this, clearly weighing patient confidentiality against the unusual circumstances. He's responding better than expected physically, she said finally. But I'll be honest, Dr. Reynolds, he's struggling emotionally. Cancer is isolating under the best circumstances, and his situation has additional complexities. The subtle reference to his solo journey, the absence of a devoted Claire figure in his life, hung unspoken between us. I nodded, understanding. Completely. Thank you for consulting on this, Dr. Kim said as our call concluded. Your insights were invaluable, and if you're open to it, I'd like to continue these discussions as the treatment progresses. The crossover implications for your work at Vertex seem significant. I'd be happy to, I agreed. Just let me know when you have new data to review. After we disconnected, I sat quietly in my home office, processing the strange new reality in which I had become a consultant on my ex-husband's cancer treatment, the very man who had walked away from mine. Life's symmetry sometimes manifested in ways too perfect to be coincidental, yet too ironic to be planned. 2 days later, as I was preparing for my first full-time day at Vertex since completing radiation, a text message arrived from an unfamiliar number. Olivia, it's Mark. Dr. Kim mentioned your consultation was helpful. Thank you. I know you have no obligation to assist with my treatment. I stared at the message, considering whether and how to respond. After a moment's reflection, I typed, "The science is fascinating. Dr. Kim is excellent. I'm glad you're seeing a positive response." His reply came quickly. "The trust you established is saving my life. The irony isn't lost on me." Before I could respond, another message appeared. "I've been thinking about what you said. About energy being a limited resource during treatment. You were right. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed that energy. Truly sorry." The explicit apology he hadn't offered during our in-person meeting finally arrived via text. Perhaps easier to express through the distance technology provided, or perhaps only now fully realized as he experienced what I had endured largely without him. Either way, it struck me how little I needed it anymore. The wound had healed, not perfectly, but sufficiently. The scar remained, but it no longer pained me. "Thank you," I replied simply. "Focus your energy on healing now." 1 year to the day after Mark had walked out during my chemotherapy, a gray, Tuesday morning that had once seemed like the end of everything, I stood in a sunlit laboratory at Vertex, watching as preliminary results from our latest immunotherapy trial populated the computer screen. The data was promising, showing significant response rates in patients with certain genetic markers. "This is remarkable," Dr. Wei said, scrolling through the findings with growing excitement. "If these trends hold through the expanded trial, we could be looking at a breakthrough for multiple cancer types." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," I cautioned, though I shared his optimism. "But yes, the preliminary indicators are excellent." Catherine joined us, reviewing the data with her characteristic calm assessment. "Your insights on the NK cell activation pathways were key to this success, Olivia. The board will be very pleased." As my colleagues continued analyzing the results, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. Had Mark not walked away during my treatment? Had I not been forced to reconstruct my life from its foundations? Had I not experienced cancer from the patient's perspective, would I have developed the specific insights that contributed to these promising results? There was no way to know for certain, but I suspected not. The unique perspective I brought to Vertex's research, the dual vantage point of scientist and survivor, had emerged directly from the crisis that had once seemed only destructive. Something new and valuable had been forged in that crucible of suffering and abandonment. Later that evening, as Claire and I shared dinner in our brownstone, technically mine, but she had moved into the guest room permanently after starting her new position, my phone chimed with an incoming call. "Doctor." Kim's name appeared on the screen. "Dr. Reynolds?" she began when I answered, her voice carrying the careful neutrality doctors cultivate for difficult news. "I wanted to call you directly rather than having you hear through other channels." Mark's condition has taken a significant turn. Despite the positive initial response, we're seeing disease progression in several areas. I closed my eyes briefly, processing this, but not entirely surprised. Pancreatic cancer was notorious for developing resistance to even the most promising treatments. What's the prognosis now? Weeks rather than months, Dr. Kim replied gently. We're transitioning to palliative measures focused on quality of life. Does he have adequate support? I asked, thinking of Mark alone in what had once been our shared life. Minimal, Dr. Kim acknowledged. A health aide visits daily, but he has no family locally since his parents moved to Arizona. He's quite isolated. After we ended the call, I sat silently at the kitchen table, Claire watching me with concerned eyes. Mark? She asked simply. I nodded. The treatment stopped working. He's transitioning to hospice care. I'm sorry, Claire said, surprising me with her genuine sympathy. Despite everything, that's difficult news. Yes, I agreed quietly. It is. The following morning, I contacted Dr. Kim again, not as a scientific consultant but as someone who understood both sides of the cancer experience all too intimately. By afternoon, I had connected Mark with the same hospice service that had provided guidance during my own treatment, offering expertise in pain management and emotional support during cancer's most difficult passages. You don't have to do this, Claire said as I reviewed palliative care resources that evening. No one would expect you to involve yourself in his end-of-life care. I know, I replied, looking up from the materials spread across our dining table. But sometimes the most healing action isn't what others expect or what seems justified by past hurts. It's what aligns with who you've become. The woman Mark had left behind wouldn't have had the strength to extend compassion toward the man who abandoned her. But I was no longer that woman. Cancer and its aftermath had transformed us both. Him through the humbling experience of facing mortality alone, me through the empowering discovery of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Full circle indeed. Not a perfect circle, not a restoration of what had been lost, but something new and unexpected. The capacity to offer grace where once there had been only pain, to find meaning in suffering, to build from ashes a life more authentic than the one that had burned away. His leaving during my darkest hours had nearly broken me. But in that breaking and careful reconstruction, I had discovered strength beyond survival, the strength to extend compassion even toward the one who had caused such harm. Not because he deserved it, but because offering it had become essential to who I was becoming. And in that becoming lay the true healing, not a return to who I had been before, but an evolution into someone wiser, clearer, and finally, completely free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.